Hello, I'm Bryant Shulato, Business Development Process Manager with Eagle Certification Group. First, I'd like to thank SQF for hosting the Learning Lunch today and for David for being with us and sharing his valuable knowledge. Just a little bit about who Eagle is. We celebrated our 20th year in business in 2014. We hold accreditations through the ANAB, ANSI, and the IOB. We have over 1,800 active certificates in 15 countries, and we deliver those certificates utilizing over 100 competent auditors. Here you can see the 6 core markets that we serve, which really touch just about every industry type, including service businesses. Eagle is committed to the food industry by serving on various committees, working groups, and task force, including the Global Food Safety Initiative Auditor Competency Technical Working Group and the Accreditation Task Force. We also serve on the Safe Quality Food Auditor Competency Subcommittee and the IAF ISO Co-Chair Food Working Group. We've been honored with a few SQF Achievement Awards. In 2014, Eagle Auditor Roger Roth was selected as Auditor of the Year. And for 2 years running in 2011 and 2012, Eagle Certification Group was a Certification Body of the Year. Eagle prides ourselves on living by our motto of service, integrity, and value. We live this motto through having a single point of contact, utilizing consistent audit scheduling practices and certification delivery, by conducting required ongoing competency and training with our auditors, by evaluating our survey process and using that to drive continuous improvement, and then by value-added services such as free training delivered through WebExes and other various presentations for clients and auditors alike. If there aren't any questions, here's our contact information. Please feel free to get a hold of us if you do have any needs or questions for Eagle Certification Group. There are a few different ways to get a hold of us, and we'll certainly address those quickly as they come in. Just like to thank you for attending, and now I'm pleased to introduce to you Mr. David J. Evanson. David has 35 years of laboratory management, food testing, and plant assessment experience. He is owner and principal of Evanson Microbiological Services, LLC. Dave has developed and instructed numerous educational programs, courses, workshops, and webinars. Topics include principles of food microbiology, good laboratory practices, root cause analysis, environmental monitoring, food microbiological methodology, and method validation. He has consulted in a variety of food industry segments related to food safety, including system pre-assessment, microbial risk assessment, environmental monitoring, food contamination and spoilage investigations, due diligence, process validation support, and ISO 17025 accreditation. Dave is a member of the International Association for Food Protection, AOAC International, Institute of Food Technologists, and American Association for Laboratory Accreditation. He is a member of the A2LA Accreditation Council and also serves on the American Association for Laboratory Accreditation Board of Directors. He holds an MBA from the Keller Graduate School of Management, a Master's in Microbiology from the Illinois Institute of Technology, and Bachelor's of Science in Biology from the University of Illinois. Dave is also a certified food scientist with IFT. Thank you, Dave.
Well, thank you. And hopefully today's discussion will really be a build-on from some information that was shared at the SQF conference a year or so ago. We have a few goals, as we indicated in some of the objectives, and hopefully being able to improve the effectiveness of investigations. Of course, we always hope you don't have to engage in an investigation, but very often events preclude our wishes. And what we really want to try to do is share some specific responses and actions when pathogens are detected. We focus a lot on pathogen events but also share some investigation protocols and decision points within the investigation. And I think it's important to note the term decision points, because a lot of people, ask about and try to direct inquiries related to kind of a formula for investigations. And while there's a number of good foundational points and basic information and a structure to follow, invariably, because of the diversity of plants' environments and the processes and the products that are being produced, there is some decisions that have to be made locally. And decisions mean judgment, and judgment is best exercised when there's information. And so we'll focus a lot on having the ability and the information necessary to help make the judgments and the decisions that are going to be required in investigations. Just to start out, just lay the foundation. Most people have some type of environmental monitoring program, EMP. Clearly, they have a huge benefit in the food processing industry for a number of different reasons. And one of the main reasons is to detect and eliminate sources of contamination in the plant environment or on equipment. And I think the key here is the point of in the second bullet point is it's a seek and destroy mission, and we start with a type of a routine monitoring approach and gathering the information, and that's best affected when we have a more aggressive seek and destroy type of approach to that routine monitoring. It not only helps make sure that we are finding problems if they do exist, but it also is valuable when we talk about going back to historical information and trend analysis, et cetera, in an investigation, having that information be of value because we had a seek and destroy type of mentality, as opposed to going through the motions and gathering good data. And then all EMPs are part of the core elements of the complete food safety program for companies. Again, this is something that's geared towards prevention, just like GFSI, SQF approaches to production, et cetera, that we're trying to use this as primarily a prevention tool. Just a brief review of the reasons for environmental programs. There's a number of different uses for them. Obviously, food safety verification is huge, but there's also some risk management and other uses, customer requirements sometimes, GFSI or other audit requirements may call for this. While the EMP programs may have some application, for instance, verification of hygienic design of equipment, where we're gathering data and using that data to make other decisions, it's not necessarily going to lead to an investigation per se. It's a helpful kind of source of information. When we talk about investigations, the two bullet points that we have in bold here, assessing the sanitation programs, verifying those, and of course any issues with cross-contamination. Those are the two areas that generally drive an investigation and kind of the background to which we'll focus our discussion. So we have two different types of environmental monitoring programs. You can break it out into many other subsets, but if we think in terms of routine type of program where we're doing evaluations of our sanitation processes, related to the manufacturer, other factors related to the procedures associated with the environment, these tend to be outlined within the company, and sometimes we have customers that input. They usually involve monitoring a specific number of sites. There's usually a list, and people may rotate through the list, selecting sites based on risk as well as baseline information and historical information. And, of course, there's some frequency associated with this, all for the purpose of finding an issue if it exists before it reaches the finished product. And, of course, using and interpreting this information implies good understanding of the equipment and the facility, and utilizing the zone concept, which we'll talk about. Then we have the investigational mode, which the bulk of this webinar is focused on. And this involves going outside and looking at areas and places that would be outside of the routine monitoring program, as well as re-examining the routine site. We're really trying to identify the source of some contamination and also the extent of the contamination. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. It's not just about a source, but also the extent. And we'll talk about what it means in terms of when we see something, how to interpret that. And this investigation will involve root cause analysis, of which I understand this was a recent webinar that was had. There's a lot of reasons for the investigational programs to be implemented. Obviously, the big one is if we get pathogen results or some other types of results that we find to be a risk or a problem for a product. But it can occur because of maybe out of specification or product results, feedback from either customers or possibly regulatory situations. They also lead us to do some investigations. And then we'll talk about events, but sometimes and very often there's some event, major event in the process, such as some kind of construction, a roof leak, major maintenance, that could also create event or want us to do some investigation because of observations or other factors that were involved. So what we want to do is spend a few minutes here talking about some of the microbial basics. We're really focused, when we talk about the EMP in this investigation, on microbial contamination, not so much, say, allergen or gluten, although many of these concepts can apply in general. But when we're talking about microbial contamination, we have a few essential pieces of information or knowledge points that we're going to use in the investigation and making the decisions that we talked about. And first is essentially knowing the way that the organisms can grow, because we're dealing with the possibility or the risks of microorganisms, not a single cell being present, but their ability to grow in certain environments. And the organisms are just like us. They need food, they need water, and then obviously some time in order to grow. And they essentially start with 1, become 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, etc. And so all the food plants that we have are going to have some type of food source in there. And depending on the process, there may or may not be water on a continual, intermittent basis. And so essentially all we need to do is have the organisms be present. And since we're not dealing within a sterile environment, we're going to have organisms being introduced on a regular basis from any number of sources. And so most processing plants have the conditions that can allow for organisms to grow. There are ways of perhaps mitigating these conditions for growth, and so we also break processes into wet and dry operations. And this graphic is to show that, essentially with a dry operation, there can be some potential for controlling water. The more we can control the water, the presence of the water, the more we can control or mitigate the growth of the microorganisms. Whereas in a wet operation, where we would expect water to be present for any number of reasons, that can't be a mitigating factor, and so we're usually left with time or temperature as being our major control points. One thing I'd like to point out when we talk about dry versus wet operations is often folks will think in terms of the product itself, the matrix or the material being produced, as being wet or dry, or the process. When we talk about a dry operation, we're talking about the absence of water. And so while the product itself may be dry when it's done a low moisture food, say a cereal or something, that doesn't necessarily mean that either some parts of the process won't use water, for instance, using steam jacketed equipment to heat or create dry conditions, or possibly wet cleaning. That would be part of the sanitation programs, even though the product is considered dry. Those would still be considered wet operations. And so very often we can have situations where part of the process may be considered dry and other parts of that process may be wet. So it's not always an all or nothing situation. We also have the concepts of growth niches, as we've talked about, and biofilms. And the idea here is that we're creating situations or allowing situations to occur in the plant environment where the organisms are capable of growing to very large numbers, which then can contaminate a large amount of the product. So growth niches themselves can also be called harborage sites. These are two key points for consideration, is that these not only allow for the propagation of the microorganisms, and this is when it's in the plant environment, the facility, equipment itself, but also there's conditions that allow for the dispersion of the microbial population. In other words, if they stay in some little nook or cranny and they're not being dispersed, they're really not going to have much of a chance to contaminate the product. And so we have not just the conditions to grow, but we can also have, we have to have the conditions for dispersion or transfer or some vector that allows the organisms to get from their little harborage site to the product or other areas. One of the key ideas here in terms of investigations, but also in routine monitoring, is that this growth isn't always continual. A lot of folks get the paradigm that it's either always happening or never happening. And again, we can have situations where, again, for instance, with control of water, where we can have intermittent situations of growth. We can have control for a good period of time, and then for whatever reason, condensation, sometimes seasons, where moisture or water can come in and allowing for the growth. And so while there can be situations of continual propagation, we might also have to consider, particularly in our investigations, that there might be an intermittent type of situation. The biofilms themselves, these are a subset of microbial growth niches. They're not a new concept. They've been around for a while, but it's in the last, so many years that we've really gotten a handle in understanding where these are at and how to address them, more importantly. Essentially, this is where bacteria attach to a solid surface. They have the ability intrinsically within the organism, which many do, to produce an extracellular material that basically enclose and anchor the bacteria to the surfaces, whether it's a stainless steel surface, concrete, etc. This extracellular material then protects the cells from the general cleaning and sanitation efforts that we see, and are very difficult to remove once they're there. So these become very problematic if allowed to occur. So this is a micrograph of biofilms, and I think it sometimes helps to see the picture to understand the concept. And so if we look at the upper left corner, you can see a number of different microorganisms, individual cells, and these would be what we would call planktonic cells. They're would be fairly easily removed with proper cleaning and sanitation. You can see that the cells are more or less sitting on the surface, as opposed to the lower right, where you can see that they're cells, they're individual cells, but you can see some filaments starting to form. And these are the beginning where they're starting to form attachments to that surface. And so therefore would pose a little bit more difficult situation as far as removal. Typically, these would still be fairly easily removed for normal cleaning. Certainly, the organisms are susceptible to the sanitation, practices. And so while a more problematic situation, usually not one that would be not overcome by routine practices, validated practices. In the center, we see the biofilm. We see both heavily attached cells as well as the enclosure, the film or the glue that is formed. And you can see that not only would the cells be more difficult to remove with normal cleaning practices, but also the sanitizer wouldn't be very effective at all. And this is why the biofilms pose a particularly difficult situation if they're formed. What causes them? Any number of things. A few examples here where if we talk about inadequate cleaning practices, typically it's because the ineffective cleaning will minimize the effectiveness of the sanitizer. The organisms remain, and this occurs over time. It's usually not a one-time deal. The biofilms take some time to form, so this is something that is happening on an ongoing basis. We talk about insufficient sanitizing. Usually this is the wrong strength of the sanitizer, often over time. Sometimes maybe not the correct sanitizer for the organism that is being addressed. Assembly example would be, gaskets aren't set correctly. And then, of course, the equipment design where we have lots of metal-to-metal contact surfaces, or they're very difficult to disassemble or reassemble, creating situations on an infrequent basis perhaps, but it still can occur. Typically, these are going to appear visually clean to our eyes. We're not going to necessarily see what's happening here. And, of course, they're problematic after a critical control point. One of the concepts to think about when we're talking about investigations or where these things may be occurring is this phrase, if you can't see it or reach it, you can't clean it or sample it. And so this applies to both the sanitation, it applies to our routine EMP, the sites that we're taking on a routine basis, effective, and usually in our investigations, and we'll talk about the walkthroughs and the selection of sites and investigations, but basically this concept here really comes into play in investigations. These are the areas that, for whatever reason, usually for convenience or ease, we don't get a good chance to clean it or sample it, and therefore understand what's really happening at that particular point. The other piece to this is the zone concept, and most people have the zone concept in play for their EMPs, and essentially it breaks the processing environment into food contact surfaces and non-food contact surfaces. And food contact, there's some examples here, but essentially listed as a zone 1. And basically the team assigns where these, what are sites within the zone 1. And again, as with many things, not always clear. So there's very clear and direct food contact surfaces, but then there can be some equipment that a decision has to be made by the company. For instance, something that overhangs a product contact surface, such as a control panel, that can directly impact the food product. And even though that's not a food contact site, it still has a very high risk of contamination, and should that be a zone 1 or a zone 2. The non-food contact sites, again, some examples listed here, broken out into zones 2, 3, and 4. The examples here go into a little bit more detail with both the sites that would be considered, both on food contact surfaces and those that aren't, the zone 2 being close proximity, zone 3, general plant environment, and zone 4, generally considered more remote, and the type of testing that's usually associated with these. Normally, zone 1 is not tested for food pathogens in the routine testing. However, that may be an important consideration when doing investigations, to expand the investigational aspects to include pathogen testing on food contact surfaces. This needs to obviously be determined within the company beforehand. You want to have that plan in place and not wait until you are in investigational mode to know if that is an option for you. Zones 2, 3, and 4 typically pathogen testing, and sometimes Zone 2 will include the indicators. The graph, the pie chart on the right, is a general idea of where a routine monitoring testing kind of breaks out in the world overall. So you can see that roughly 25% of the samples are Zone 1, 40% Zone 2, 30% Zone 3, and a small percentage on Zone 4. And so you can see that in general, the food industry really focuses, 70% of the effort on the Zone 2 and 3. That could change in your particular situation, but also this would change dramatically if you were in an investigation mode, depending upon where that site was and the risks that you identify as far as your investigation. Typically, we break out the sites to the semantics of the environment versus the equipment. Pretty straightforward. Plant environment is not specifically involved with the process, so general areas, whereas the equipment, machinery, and materials that's involved with the manufacturing process, and a number of examples given here. The last point from a microbiological perspective is the population dynamics. And one of the things that are concepts we want to keep in mind when we're doing an investigation is to determine whether the microorganisms that we recover and the sites that we are looking at contain either transient or fixed cells. By transient, we mean these are those planktonic cells that we showed in the micrograph. They're easily removed by the cleaning and sanitation procedures, and they don't really establish permanent populations. Again, the environment is not sterile. We have organisms that come in and go out, and our cleaning and sanitation practices address those quite well. And so we might be taking a sample at a point in time where we have a transient organism coming through, we see it, but our practices would take care of it. Then, of course, the fixed populations are what we talked about with the biofilms and the Harvard sites, where they're there to stay unless we do something about it. So one of the ways that we understand if the transient or fixed has to do with the data that we gather, and we'll talk about when we go back and resample a site and do we find it again or not. But very often it also involves characterization of the isolates. And there's been a number of published studies showing the relationship of a source or sources within a plant and the ongoing presence of certain types of strains. And so when we talk about characterization of isolates, we're not just talking about the species that we find, but we're talking about the specific strain. And so, for instance, with Salmonella, we would look at this by serotyping. With Listeria, there's been a number of studies or publications about multi-locus enzyme electrophoresis, again, looking at that specific strain as opposed to just the species. Many, as you may know, many of the public health activities of the recent years have put whole genome sequencing on the map in terms of a much more prominent tool that's used, again, to link strains that are found in human cases with either the food product itself that may be associated with the illness or the environment that that product was produced in. There's other ways of characterizing isolates. One that's got some promise, at least appears to have, is maybe the multi-top. It's a time of flight using a laser and desorption ionization type technology that can also characterize isolates. And this is something that's more than just looking at if a site is positive or negative. So I know that root cause analysis is something that many companies train folks on in using different semantics and terminologies. Hopefully this list that I've put up here isn't in too much conflict with what was discussed last month, but they all have a common set of steps and principles. And the investigations that we engage in for an environmental monitoring positive are essentially root cause analysis in a much narrower focus in terms of considerations and things that we worry about. So clearly we have to define what we have and then go through a number of other steps. And I think that just as we see with root cause analysis in general, definition is very critical. And sometimes it's part of the problem. And I'll show an example or two here in a second. But the ability to define the nonconformance in a very clear manner so that all parties involved understand what we mean. And that helps with the initial investigation and what's going on, as well as long-term. And if we think in terms of historical trends going back to data that may go back months or a year, we want to know what we were dealing with before and how much is this new event truly related to the past event. And the last piece to the properly defining the nonconformance, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is the regulatory and customer review. And then there might be situations where there's an outside third party that may see some of these investigations, and having a clear definition of what's going on is very important. We then go to containment. Often it's termed a quick fix. For EMPs, it's a couple of points in doing something very quick. Not all sites that are positive may need containment actions, and so you would make that decision relative to the risks. Gathering data and evidence is extremely important. Data is critical in the investigations. The whole concept of evidence versus anecdote is very important. And so we want to make sure that we don't skip this part. And very often in EMPs, this is kind of short-circuited, and we kind of jump to cause very quickly, and should try to avoid doing that. The next steps, identification and selection of both the root causes and corrective actions, as well as the implementation. Note that this is plural. Every single one of these is root causes, corrective actions, more than one. And I do this because there's a paradigm that exists that there should be only one root cause, kind of like there's only one correct answer on a test. And in our situations with EMPs and having events that we are investigating, that's not necessarily true. If we think in terms of a process that's been ongoing and we've had a fair amount of confidence in process control, and now we see that something is occurring, it's usually not one thing alone. There's usually multiple factors that have caused this series of safety nets to now not work. And usually if there's more than one root cause, there's usually going to need to be more than one corrective action. And so don't fall into the mindset that there's only one thing to do. Keep an open mind relative to multiple root causes, multiple corrective actions. And of course, then at the end, we have to measure and verify the success of that. And we'll emphasize a single data point is not verification. Regardless of the specifics of the methodology or the terms that you use or how many steps that you have, the idea here is that the process must be approached in a systematic manner. And that's key. So a couple of examples when we talk about properly defining the nonconformance. If we say we have Listeria species at the spiral freezer entry, that can mean a lot of different things. Whereas if we say more definitively, we have the Listeria species under the wet insulation on the right side. And also we made the observation that there's some compromised, gasket that may be compromised. That's far better, both in terms of setting our sights on the investigation and trying to begin the root cause analysis in a focused way, and brings everybody on the same page. It also helps us down the road if we have to go back and understand if this is a repeat event or something different, even though it's in a similar location. When we talk about containment, almost always we need to consider disposition of product. Is product affected by the site? And of course, if it's a non-conforming product, it's out of spec, et cetera, clearly. But again, the zone concept helps us understand if we have to concern ourselves at that particular site, whether there's product that's being affected. And almost always when we see some containment type of actions, companies will initiate some cleaning back to that site. And so that has both the containment issue, but also helping us understand later on, if we resample, gathering data at that point as to whether or not we might have a transient versus fixed population. Sometimes it doesn't help. And so in our example here, I don't know that just cleaning some wet insulation is necessarily going to eliminate the problem. Then we gather the data, and I think we need to go back to the basics and pull information and not assume anything. And I hear a lot of people, don't go back to the SSOP. We all know what it is. I helped write it. But the point is that you want to not assume anything, and you want to go basically to the point of what should have been done and what really did happen. And you go back to the very beginning to know that and verify that as opposed to assuming. Of course, the historical data, we talked about the accuracy of that information. We'll talk about the importance of records in a bit. Usually there's going to be some additional sampling and testing that's needed to gather some additional data. And as we start into this process, really try to keep the concept of cause and effect in mind. It's an elemental scientific principle. It's something that is part of root cause analysis, but it is really important, and very often in this investigational process, we sometimes lose sight of that and try to bring yourselves back to cause and effect as much as possible. So what do we do when we have this? What's this process look like? Well, you pull together a cross-functional team. Team input is essential. Not every person has all the answers. Not any one person has all of the knowledge. And so there's a group of people will be the pool of information and pool of knowledge that can help address. And it's very important that this process pretty much leaves out any past paradigms in politics at the door, and there's an open and candid discussion. The gathering of the data, as we said, with the first few examples, but also look at the procedures that were taken. We talked before about the aggressiveness of the monitoring. What were the procedures followed? What were our previous findings? Have the people walk physically through the plant. I know that everybody involved probably walks those areas, multiple times a day. But in the investigational mode, it's with a different set of eyes. It's with, again, the seek and destroy focus. And interviewing the personnel that are associated with that particular area or surrounding area. Just to give you an example, numerous times that I personally have been involved in investigations, and other people that I know have the same experience. We come in and we meet with management. And for those of you with supervisor and manager in your title, this is not a personal comment, but we sit down and we have a discussion. We have the background. we see the data, we're sitting in a conference room or an office, and that's where we say, well, we don't know why, because. When we go out into the plant, we do the walkthroughs, understand things. I can't tell you how many times the core or the real direction came from talking to the personnel, whether it's the operators, maintenance crew, sanitation people, who have more basic understanding of what goes on day in and day out and events that occur that don't get filtered up through the process, and they're not part of the data and the information that's up in the offices or the conference rooms. And they can talk about events that occur intermittently. It can occur, only a couple of times a month. Things that don't get collected in the normal course of events. And that kind of information is very critical in an investigation of a positive. One of the areas that we would see as far as considering root causes, and something that should always be kind of in the forefront of thought, are considering any changes in a procedure or process. Very, very often, some type of change of that nature precedes an event, and it's not necessarily 1 or 2 days. Sometimes this is a lingering situation, so you don't just go back to the calendar of the last few days or week. But there's significant changes, and there's a list of areas that the change can affect the event, and you can think of a number of different examples with these. This is also where your tools from the root cause analysis comes in, whether you're using brainstorming to help understand data, where was there any equipment maintenance or capacity issues where we push things through a little bit more. Flowcharts and maps are very helpful at this point to understand what might happen. We'll talk about maps towards the end, but those are very powerful tools when we start the root cause considerations. And then your cause and effect tools that are part of the root cause analysis, and the two that work really, really well for EMP type situations is the 5 whys and the fishbone diagrams. So we do have a positive. The product should be considered, retain the effective product if possible, so disposition is very important. Isolate the sites and apply cleaning, like we said. That's the containment piece, as well as possibly beginning some data gathering. And then when you resample, it's important to try to mimic the conditions as much as possible. So resampling at the same time of day as the initial sample helps. And again, this is the very beginning steps to help if this is a transient or a fixed population. This is a little bit softer approach and very often more appropriate for sanitation type things and indicators as opposed to pathogens. So all this can work in, of course, the zone. So if we're looking at a zone 3 or 4, this might be appropriate. But if we have, say, a zone 2, we might be a little bit more aggressive, even if it's the first time. And so whether it's a second time or a more aggressive approach to the first time, again, disposition of the product needs to be part of the consideration. Regulatory and customer implications. So if you're in a regulatory type of environment, you have some rules and some guidelines that you have to follow. But essentially, the repetitive result indicates a hardware site now. So we've moved that second time. We've moved from potential of a transient to less likelihood and more of a hardware site has occurred. And obviously, we're in investigational mode, so we've got our team assembled. We define the nonconformance, the containment, and we also then start gathering all the data that we've discussed from the different sources and start the investigational swabbing. And in this process, we want to stay focused on the cause and effect. One important point relative to this site being positive is that very often the original positive is a symptom and not the disease. In other words, don't assume that that's the only place that it can be. This might just be an effect of some type of expansion or extension from an original positive site. And so you want to make sure that in your investigation you've covered that possibility and not assuming that once I've eliminated this site, I've eliminated the source. Typically with investigational swabbing, we expand the area. People say, well, how far? I say 10 to 15 feet, but that really is more dependent on the operation and the design of the flow. So again, the judgment is where do we have the potential for something, a site within this area to contribute, as well as if this is the original site, has it spread? One good technique is to, after the cleaning, the preoperative sanitation, to sample at that point. And again, 3 hours, maybe 6 hours, 8 hours, depends on how long your production on that batch or lot is. But also looking at surrounding areas to see if maybe the population is reduced and we're not detecting it, but there's an opportunity for growth over time, and now it starts dispersing. Remember the idea of growth and dispersion, and it starts dispersing over time, not necessarily immediate. So as an example of zone 3 site is positive, you do adjacent zone, adjacent areas, but you also might want to also look upstream and downstream relative to zone 2 and possibly zone 4. Again, you're trying to understand why this is here and not just address that site alone. The other point is not to just limit to sponges and swabs, which are your typical tools on a routine monitoring. What we want to do is make sure that we cover product residue. Some processes would have that. Some EMPs may have product residue as a part of the routine. Often this is a very good sample because of the nature of its compositing over time, and you can see what may happen in that process throughout the batch. Air sampling, whether it's general or compressed air systems. I know SQF has some requirements in there, but often you might want to go back and do it at a more frequent basis in an investigation just to verify. And then other places, through in vacuum systems, but there's many other places that you might want to go to that aren't just the swab and sponge type of situation. Also, try not to limit yourself to specific units of measure. Some programs will call for sampling a 10 by 10 square area, 100 square centimeters, something like that. You're in an investigation. You're trying to figure things out, and limiting yourself to a specific areas when there's much more to be taken impedes your ability to solve the problem. And you just keep doing this until you gather your data and you determine by the information gathered the source. So let's say it doesn't work. We got a third positive at that site. So this might be a good time to go on vacation and leave it to somebody else, or maybe dust off your resume. But this happens, and there's no silver bullet to this. Basically, you go back and you start over with what you've done before. Just something was missed. Again, we talked a lot about intermittent situations, causes that aren't a continual presence, and so maybe some of those investigations didn't find your source or ideas for sources the first time around. So regroup with your team. Again, go back to the basics that we talked about with microbial considerations. Expand your investigational sampling to maybe some areas that you didn't include before. Of course, the areas that you did that show the highest risk. And then you might want to also consider your sampling plan for product, again, depending upon the site, and maybe increase that a bit to make sure that you have a little bit higher statistical probabilities. Corrective actions. So you want your root causes, as we talked about, to be based on evidence, observations of the data. And corrective actions are tangible changes in the process. So retraining is not a corrective action. Again, if you go through the 5 why process, we'll get to something else rather than retraining people. So here's a few examples, and we replaced the compromised material or conveyor. Maybe we saw a pipe is condensing and we wanted to stop that from happening. Maybe we've changed our cleaning procedure. We've changed an SOP to include, in this example, the removal of the back plate on a pump. Maybe we want to measure our sanitizer strength on a more frequent basis than we were doing before. Some other examples might include fixing spot welds to be continuous welds, or smoothing rough welds to remove some harbored sites. So when we talk about what we're going to do to remove something, it's a tangible action. And that's more likely to result in a more permanent solution than things that are more symptomatic or generalization. And of course, you want to include what's going to happen with the product, as we've said repeatedly. It's very important to identify who's responsible for the corrective action. The person who is responsible also has to have the authority to be able to implement that. And so sometimes we have to push that up a little bit up the food chain in order to make sure that these things happen. And again, that's where the team comes into play. And then ongoing verification. We want to make sure that the corrective action really did address the problem. And like I said, a single data point is not the proof. So we might have a situation where we do have to deal with the disposition of product. If we do have that, clearly we need to take into account the differences between the zones, particularly Zone 1 versus others. If we go into investigational mode and we're doing product contact surfaces, we need to understand that a positive on the product contact surface implicates the finished product, and therefore should not be distributed into commerce. And simply retesting for purpose of negating a positive is not scientifically acceptable, and so it's not a consideration. You're retesting or you're resampling for purposes of understanding if you removed the problem. Of course, Zone 2 doesn't directly implicate the lot. You're looking at trends, and of course we're talking about transient or fixed as much as we can determine. And then the Zone 3s and 4s usually don't have product disposition concerns. If we do have, and again, this is kind of getting a little bit outside of the EMP continuum, but often as a result of our investigations and where we've been, we need to stop production. There's possibilities corrective actions may stop production because of pulling some equipment out or doing some major maintenance. If we start up with production, might want to consider some more extensive sampling of the finished product, meaning that the finished product sampling plan would be adjusted for some period of time. This is not forever, but usually for some number of lots or batches to be run through, usually anywhere from 3 to 7, to say, okay, we feel that we're in good shape. And also increasing the frequency and the sites for the EMP for some period of time post-corrective. Again, gathering enough data to feel comfortable that we've really addressed this, and thinking again in terms of the intermittent situations that a couple of days worth of data is not enough. You want to gather the data points over a period of time. Often asked about data management. We'll touch a couple of real quick points here. If you're doing quantitative testing in the indicator, it's best to convert to log 10. It helps distinguish real differences rather than real numbers. Plate counts usually are what's impacted here. We talked about the unit of measure. Because the primary goal is to identify possible problems, limiting to specific measurable surfaces can be counterproductive to that primary goal. Of course, acting on things immediately and not waiting. to do things because we got to wait until the Thursday morning meeting to address this. We got any aberrant results, we want to deal with it right away. And then also sometimes people say, well, how should we track this? How should we record this? We talked about keeping things in detail. Really, the best thing is what works for you. I'm not saying it is a cop-out, but there's a lot of good ways of collecting your data. The format depending on how this information is used, how many people it needs to go to, what the skill sets and the tools that the corporation or the company provides you. You want to simplify your trending. And I think one of the keys that really helps is being able to create graphics, pictures to help understand the data, not just big tables. And keep in mind that very often there's an upstream to this sharing of information, particularly when we have investigations. And so you want to have the ability for upper management to understand what you've been doing. Typically, they're not going to be technically oriented, and so you're translating what you've done for them to understand that you did the job. Here's why we thought this problem occurred, and we've mitigated it. And often the graphics and pictures help with that. The ongoing verification, so again, we don't stop just because it appears solved. We stop the additional testing when we know it's solved, and then we have the effective actions in place. Of course, the documentation we've covered. Again, the document and recording in such a way that the investigation and information is clear to someone not involved in the process. Again, we talked about other third parties, particularly regulatory or customers, but also people change roles and responsibilities, and they might not all the people are there that originally there for the discussion later on. In other words, we want to try to deal with facts and not tribal lore. And then for maps, I think this is a very powerful tool. I see a lot of people using them now, where you have the floor plan or the product flow laid out, and then specific points where you have either events or risk areas. So risk areas like drains or water sources or previous positives, or events such as maintenance, et cetera, or risk areas, pipes coming through the walls and condensation that might occur. And so having maps not only gives you a good source for investigation purposes and gives you facts in that picture, but is also great data points to go back to, and it has part of the historical information. I know that there's some commercial sources for these maps now, and it's not something that you necessarily have to create internally. So we've covered these points, and so I think we're done. And if there's still time for questions, I suppose we can do those.
Hi, Dave. Thank you very much for that presentation. Yes, I do believe that there are a few questions that just came in. I sent them over to you in your chat box. Did you receive them?
Okay. Let's take a look. Okay. So I have a question. Would you consider disposable aprons as a Zone 1 or Zone 2? So again, that goes to the concept of are they direct product contact or not. And so if that apron is used and the person activities and what they do causes them to have some event where they're leaning over product or possibly brushing up against the contact surfaces or adjacent areas, or in some other way allowing for that apron or that garment to transfer, I would seriously consider it as a zone 1, and obviously the whole concept of changing the garments, et cetera, from one location to the other. If those events aren't happening and they're distinctly away from that product zone or it's covered, then I'd probably consider it zone 2. Slides available, you can answer that one. Disposable aprons again. Copy of. Okay, so we have another question. What degree is data typically available on genetically matching dispersal of Listeria from zone 2, 3 to zone 1? And how often do companies continue to operate after 3 positives without testing for pathogens in zone 1? So the genetically matching, when we talk about the characterization, again, we said, for instance, with Listeria, the gel electrophoresis, I can't tell you, I don't know the number of companies that do that. I know that there are a number of them that do. Like I said, the data that's been published shows quite a bit of relationship, and it's not so much dispersal between zone, say, 2 to 1. It's just the dispersal of organisms, period. And so the data that shows the strains being able to disperse does show patterns that they're able to move and be transferred within the plant due to the vectors, not so much a zone consideration as it is the manner in which they're able to be transferred. And so and it's been demonstrated in some of those publications that they have gotten into a zone 1 situation. That's the whole point of the concern. Continuing after 3 positives, again, the number of positives happens to be relative to the zone. Again, in the zone 2, after they're continually getting the positives, there's usually some major event, some type of decision to shut down that line or that area and do some very extensive cleaning and or repair. Most people aren't going to just keep getting positive after positive and do nothing. And so when we get to that point, often, yes, it's going to involve some kind of a shutdown. Is the goal to get 0 positive results? Well, sure. Yeah. Depending upon the kind of material, the ingredients that you get in, things of that nature, that may not be possible. Again, you look at some of the USDA guidelines, and they're accepting some number of positives. So while, yes, that's the goal, really what your ingredients and your process is capable of is going to tell you what's really possible, particularly over in maybe zone 3 and particularly zone 4, because you're looking at incoming areas, you're receiving areas for raw ingredients, and if those are all containing pathogens, it might be more of a containment and a protection and prevention from spreading than getting 0 there. The difference between swabs and sponges. The main point between swabs and sponges is that a sponge is able to take a much broader and wider area, surface area. Also, you can use both sides of the sponge in taking your sample, so you can take large swaths of conveyor belts or areas that have a large surface area, whereas the swabs, the little cotton tip swabs, don't provide you that ability. On the other hand, if you are sampling small little nooks and crannies that a sponge cannot get into, the the top tip swab is able to get into those areas and provide a better sampling of that little area. So there's advantages to both of them depending upon the site. Specific chemicals, are there any specific chemicals that are recommended for removal of biofilms? Again, I would go more with your chemical company. They can make recommendations. The ones that I've seen that work, that have worked and companies have used, use a combination of hydrogen peroxide and usually quaternary ammonium. So, for instance, commercial products such as Zepraquat and Sterilix are out there, and a few others, but that's harsher chemical. You don't want to use it all the time because it can cause some other problems long term, but those have been shown to be very effective for biofilms. At what point in the process do you involve the regulatory agency? Well, it depends on your jurisdiction, whether you have USDA or FDA. This is internal and it's not involving the product, and the product has not been implicated and put into commerce within the FDA. You wouldn't necessarily need to do that. You've got containment and there's no risk to the public. The involvement might involve, if they're doing an inspection and they're looking at records, they might be looking at your investigational process. And that's why we talk about the records being thorough, complete, and telling a good story about what you did. Talked about swabs again. How long does the transient population live on the equipment? Well, it's transient because it's not finding itself able to persist. And so typically we're talking about transient population not able to grow or moving through in a short period of time, a few days or possibly a week or so. If we start having populations longer than that and they have the ability to grow, then we start seeing them fixing themselves in the biofilm formation after a few weeks. Some of these are repeat. I think maybe I'm just repeating some things now. So, Leslie. How do I know? Well, if you know what pathogen it is because you know what you've tested for specifically. The test is very specific to either Listeria, Salmonella, etc. Zone charts with designated testing locations in each zone. Yes, absolutely, because you want other people to be able to help do this, or other folks being able to understand what you did. So I would make sure that it's very clear as to what those locations mean. Another question is to swab a certain number of random areas to identify areas that are more susceptible to Listeria. I don't know where the number that you cite comes from. It could be based on the size and the person's opinion. I don't think random sampling is what you'd want to do. I think that you want to use some of the ideas that we proposed in terms of microbial risk relative to moisture, time, etc., and the ease of cleaning versus not, and the design of the equipment to know whether those particular areas are more susceptible or not. And I would focus any of my testing and any of my resources to the higher risk areas, develop baseline based on the risks that I see before I would do any type of random type of testing. And I don't know, Leslie, we're running out of time. There's a couple more questions if you want me to continue on. There's a question on whether the lab should carry out Listeria species to monocytogenes if you have a positive Listeria species test. So typically people don't. They would act on that as if it was monocytogenes. If you do select, though, to characterize the organisms, as we talked about, to determine if you have sites that are fixed versus transient, your characterization would then tell you whether it's monocytogenes or not. So typically you wouldn't. If you are characterizing, then you would know that. Quantitative test results converted to log 10. Yes, so what we're saying there is that particularly if you have higher levels of cells, say in the thousands, and that's why I'm speaking to plate count, that if you have, say, 17,000 versus 22,000, people who aren't familiar with microbial populations and the differences might think that 5,000 is a lot. But if you convert it to log, you'll see that there's a very small difference, and from a microbiological perspective, it's not a big difference, but it's easier for people to see and understand that aren't microbiologists or understanding populations to see that it's not a big difference. And so, and then also some statistics that you would run. Converting to log 10 makes it easier to do it. You normalize the data then. Peracetic acid is also used. There's a question, what are your thoughts on peracetic acid? As a sanitizer, it's very good. It's strong, but it works quite well. And again, Leslie, I don't know if you want to, what you want to do here.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending our learning lunch today. Again, just a reminder, this presentation will be available on the SQFI website under our events tab. I want to thank David so much for his presentation today and for Eagle for sponsoring. And I think that concludes our Learning Lunch webinar. So thanks, everyone. Have a good day.